This next lecture is going over costing. Costing is the method for determining or approximating the total cost of resources and associated expenditures for a particular garment style or product. Costing is the process of costing outlines a detailed estimate that includes garment component costs, labor costs, packaging costs, finishing, shipping, tariffs, if applicable, factory overhead, wholesale markup, retail markup, and list price. There are many costs associated with manufacturing apparel. The cost of goods includes all variable and fixed costs incurred during the production of a product garment style. And I know we've already gone over fixed costs in our last lecture. Variable costs are long-term expenditures, also known as investments in labor, materials, and manufacturing plants. These costs fluctuate in direct proportion to the number of units produced. Some examples of variable costs include labor for construction, garment components and materials, packaging, and freight. Fixed costs, also called non-variable costs, are short-term expenditures that do not change and are affected by they're not affected by an increase or decrease in volume because the investment in labor and manufacturing has already been made. So these are costs that are not affected by an increase or decrease in the number of units produced. Some examples of fixed costs or non-variable costs are utility bills, lease payments, taxes, employee benefits, and labor costs for personnel other than direct costs. So for example, when you sign a lease, it's for a given period of time, and your rent essentially won't go up or down within that time period. So that is a fixed cost. Overhead, manufacturing overhead, are all costs incurred by a contractor of a manufacturer for a plant to manufacture and make delivery of goods. So some overhead costs include utility bills, facility maintenance and depreciation, machine and equipment maintenance and parts, property taxes for the plant, and then workforce other than direct labor. Two main perspectives on costing are the manufacturer's perspective and the retailer's perspective. Here's an example of the comparison of the manufacturer's pricing process and the retailer's pricing process. And the picture in the middle is the item or the garment. The Callie Blake skirts. So retail price, $133, 20% off. I think that's $98 or $96. So looking over at the manufacturing pricing, they have a suggested retail price of $127. The wholesale price looks like it's $60.50, and the wholesale price is what it costs. So that's the cost of goods, how much it costs to simply make the item. And then over here on the retailer's pricing, they have a premium price, which is $130, which is a little bit higher than the suggested retail. And then they account for additional markups, or if they need to mark it down, if they additionally need to put it on sale. And they also account for their gross margin in dollar amount and also percentage amount. So they can account for how much they potentially might make. There are three basic costing methods. There's the absorption costing, which is also called whole cost method. There's the activity-based costing, which is abbreviated ABC. The direct cost estimate, or direct costing, or variable costing. And depending on where you work, they may have different names for these methods as well. Absorption costing places costs into two categories, the product cost and the operating expense. And they place a predetermined percentage of all the overhead costs into their labor costs. Activity-based costing, ABC, is the estimate of all direct and indirect production costs required to manufacture a garment style. So from this method, they will treat all costs as variable costs. And this is realistic for long-term decisions because all the costs are budgeted into product cost. And it's much easier to keep track of expenses. And it more accurately reflects costs associated with a specific garment style. Direct costing, they only consider materials, construction labor, and sales commissions as a product cost. All other expenses for the firm are placed in a general expense category. Direct costing is really great for vertical manufacturing, where all the operations occur in one place. So the costing process, it will start with a cost sheet, which is essentially a budget or projection of what a product developer thinks it will cost to make an item. So accurate costing requires continuous estimation and reevaluation. So there's constant comparison of cost comparison between sourcing places. For example, your trim or your fabrics or labor. There's always going to be reevaluation based on budget. The phases of costing, there's three phases. It starts with pre-costing, production costing, and then post-production costing. So we'll go through each of these phases. The first phase, pre-costing, also known as the preliminary cost estimate. The estimate of cost of materials is usually 35 to 60% of a total garment's cost. And then added to that is the labor costs, the producer's gross margin, also covering for overhead and the contractor's profit. And here's an example of a cost sheet for this racerback nylon ripstop mini dress with the organza placket and trim. And I know it's a little bit hard to see, but if you look down here, it says nylon ripstop. We need 1.5 yards. The price is $2.99 per yard, and total amount is $4.49. The organza fabric, they only need a quarter of a yard. It's $2.50 for a yard, and it costs 63 cents. And they do that for every single thing. So we'll go down, here's the fabric, and then we go down to trim. They need a zipper, and the zipper costs $1.63. Then they go down to labor. They have marketing costs, grading costs, cutting costs, and then construction. And that is all priced out. And then there's shipping and duty. They've got the import duty, the shipping expense. And then it goes on down, and it says the wholesale price is $24. And the suggested retail price is $48. And so every item ever made has to go through this costing process. The next phase is production costing, or called the final cost. And this is based on figures derived from approved style samples and requirements included in the spec package. So this is a little bit more detailed than the preliminary cost estimate. Estimates for construction are given per one garment, but when you get into production, most items will run quantities up into the thousands. I mean, you wouldn't just order that tank top and order 10. If a designer is going to have something manufactured, it's usually in the thousands because it's going to be distributed across the country. Production costs include fabrics, findings, labor, overhead expenses of the contractor, gross margin expenses for the contractor or vendor, and including profit. Landed costs, this is the total cost of finished garments that enter the U.S., and this includes domestic transportation to the customer or the retail location. And here's just an example of a item landed cost sheet. And it just says the description of the item. Over here, there's the description. So the example down here is a mock crew layer PK. And it says where it was made, the origin, its destination, the quantity, and it looks like it's about 6,000. The invoice value is $444,000. There's the exchange rate, there's the item price, there's the freight charge. I can't quite read that word. There's are there any duty fees? Any harbor maintenance fees, filing fees, other costs, and then it gives you a total landed costs. And again, a landed cost will need to be produced for every single item that is imported. The final stage is the actual costs. And this is if shipping of production or if shipping or production is late, the contractor will bear the responsibility to meet cost by the delivery date. And if it's produced in-house, the staff obviously has to monitor the time schedule. Another thing that comes into account when you're determining the actual costs is unpredicted factors. Like there may be material shortage, there may be some economic instability, there may be natural disasters. And if any of this happens, the profit margin will suffer and new projects may be curtailed. So like in Egypt, there was a cotton shortage a couple years ago, which put a lot of production at a halt, which significantly increased the actual cost of final garments being produced because they had to wait. Timelines were shortened extended. Okay, quick vocab lesson. Curtailed means shortened, to cut short or reduce. So to terminate or abbreviate before its intended or proper end or its full extent. So the example is my speech was cut short, or personal freedom is curtailed in many countries. Okay, product development costs. New styles generally take more time to develop and cost more because all information on the garment has to be gathered and evaluated before it can be approved for production. So a lot of companies will repeat styles from previous seasons with minor changes because that's much more cost effective. A bill of materials is a detailed list that identifies all actual materials to construct one sample garment with estimate of cost when it's produced in higher quantities. Fabric, the price and exact amount of fabric is hard to estimate because of fallout or waste. And that's just the excess material. The bill of material will also include trims and findings, and fabric can account for up to 70% of the landed cost of a garment. A bid package is also part of the costing process, and it's a document that contains the garment style specification provided to several potential contractors in order for them to get an estimate. So a bid package will be sent out to a bunch of contractors, and the contractors will check their plant capacity for production, see if they have the technology required to produce the garment style at the quality level specified. Can they do the production within a cost for the garment style? Can they do the production time, and can they follow through on delivery? And here's an example of a bid sheet. It says, if you look up over here, these are the quantities and how much. Oh no, these are the size ranges. So here's an example of what a designer would send to a manufacturer, saying, these are all my specifications. This is the kind of zipper I want. Right here, the zipper, snap. This is the kind of casing, the hood type. All the details. And then after the manufacturers looked this over, they come up with a bid and say, we can produce this to the specifications you've given within this price range. So that's called a price quote, and that's a written document submitted by a contractor in response to a bid package that includes the estimated price to produce a garment style or product. And so here's an example of a price quote, a general price quote that a lot of t-shirt companies will do. So they'll say, if you want us to produce a t-shirt with one color, one screen print color, and you only need between 24 and 50 in quantity, it will cost you $1.90 per shirt. And let's say you want 4 colors and you need between 300 and 450, it will cost you $2.75 per shirt. So this is an example of a price quote. It's not the exact price, but it's a rough quote. Labor costs is the amount of detail in an item depends on how and where the product is going to be developed. Offshore production estimates often are quoted as free on board, abbreviated FOB. The exporter or contractor has included transportation to port, handling and loading on vessels, and export duty into the quoted estimate. Couple different ways that labor costs are broken down. Garments produced inside a shop or by a domestic contractor, they have pretty detailed labor costs. You can either be paid by the piece, paid by the minute, or paid by bundle. And it just depends on the manufacturer of how they want to pay their workers to produce each style. Direct labor costs are wages for workers involved in the actual production of garment styles. Direct labor wages are used for line supervisors, cutters, sewers, and other employees who perform tasks to physically manufacture the garments. Indirect costs are expenditures that do not specifically add value to the product during production, but are necessary for the operation of the factory. So that's factory overhead, like rent, occupancy overhead, and workers that do not add value to the product during manufacturing, but contribute to the operation of the factory. So like janitorial staff, security, all of those. Here's some examples of the indirect labor costs. Wages of workers who are essential to running and maintaining the factory, but are not involved in the production of the garment. So equipment repair technicians, maintenance staff, material handlers, and security. Tariffs are taxes paid to government for importing specific goods. And when tariffs are collected, it's said that you're paying a duty tax. We have a lot of duty-free shops, and those are basically shopping outlets that are exempt from the payment of certain local or national taxes and duties, on the requirement that the goods will be sold to travelers who will take them out of the country. The types of products that can be sold as duty-free vary by jurisdiction, as well as how they can be sold and the process of calculating the duty or refund the duty component. So it depends on the location, but you see a lot of these in airports because airports are technically considered international land. When it comes to costing, it can get really complex. So a lot of companies will have accountants that specifically work in the apparel and textiles area. And you can see over here in the column of the far right, there's tariffs and the percentage of tariffs based on what you're importing. So if you're importing apparel textiles from Vietnam, the tariff is going to be 40%, China is 22%, Mexico is 23%. If you're going to import footwear, it's 50% tariff tax from Vietnam. Japan is 60%. Leather, apparel, and handbags, 50% from Vietnam, 35%. And then woolen apparel also has different tariff percentages. When a company talks about logistics, they are talking about the movement of goods between locations, and that's become really complex with growing dependence on imported goods. Overall, average shipping costs run about 9% of the total cost of goods, but they can vary greatly depending on where the goods are made. And shipping costs can be offset by having a much lower labor costs. So here are the top 10 countries of apparel imports from 2008. China is the highest with 32% as of 2008. So over here, importing to the U.S., we have Vietnam, Indonesia, Mexico, Bangladesh, India, Honduras, Cambodia, Thailand, and Hong Kong. So the closest importers are Honduras and Mexico, but the majority are from Asia.